And this poem is called Do You Remember, I Remember. Do you remember that morning when the planes crashed into the World Trade Center and turned us all into dust? Do you remember the Xerox copies of the photos of the lost and cell phone numbers written in magic markers that were plastered all over the walls of the city with their deadly cry of hope? Do you remember the beautiful poetry that turned up a few days later alongside the photos of the lost? I remember standing on Canal Street that morning, watching the towers coming down, the crowd around me breaking into tears, while others too shocked in disbelief. I remember a black man who got out alive and covered from head to toe in white dust asked me if I could get him a beer. I remember going to a hardware store to buy myself a mask, but they were sold out, so I bought an American flag handkerchief on the corner and wrapped it around my face like the Lone Ranger. People walking by said, "Excuse me, may I take your picture?" Do you remember the wilted flowers stuck on all the chain-link fences around the city? Do you remember nobody blew their horn for 3 months in New York City? Do you remember the anthrax scare? I remember calling the great Arnie Saka and a big fan of WBAI and said, "Arnie." He said, "Who's this?" I said, "Steve." He said, "Steve." I said, "Arnie." And at the same time, we said the Reichstag fire. Do you remember freedom fries? Do you remember the cops from Atlanta and Miami parked in the village and everyone starting conversations and thanking them for coming up to help with shock talk? Do you remember the attackers were from Saudi Arabia and met in Afghanistan, and then the USA destroyed the country? Do you remember all the flags and flag buttons on the jackets to show you were truly American, and folks wearing baseball hats that said NYPD, FDNY, and USA? I remember all that Uncle Sam's old glory. Do you remember the checkpoints on Canal Street and Houston Street and 14th Street and 23rd Street and so on? I had to show my ID 3 times when walking home. Do you remember the Middle Eastern profiling and the Indian man in Staten Island who was killed wearing a turban for revenge as the heat was taken off black people for a minute? Do you remember the cries for revenge and the bodies keep piling up and it's still not enough? I remember our son Baba stranded in Staten Island calling me from a phone booth telling me about all the papers that blew in from Manhattan. Do you remember Orange Alert and what's in your bag? Do you remember Union Square and all the great vibes and music and the 3 black boys singing Beatle tunes and their father was on washtub bass drowning out the politicos chanting their chickens have come home to roost? I remember one of my neighbors was part of the cleanup crew and gave me a burnt quarter. Do you remember walking by the firehouses with the mountains of flowers all around and going over to firefighters and shaking their hands and trying to find the right words? I remember going to Ladder Company 39 because my friend Keith Glasso had worked there, and I gave out copies of my Warm It Up home. They made me coffee, the firefighters did, and we talked what a beautiful man Keith was. I met his parents a week later. There were tears underneath my shades, and they were so stoic. I remember my great friend Tony Fish Nunziata rang my bell, and I couldn't recognize his voice, but I buzzed him in anyhow, and he walking up the stairs wearing a fireman's suit and his face full of gray dust. I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "It's me, Tony." I said, "What are you doing in that outfit?" He said, "I've been putting out fires down at Ground Zero as a volunteer." He started to wash up. I could see his face now. He said as soon as he heard about the first plane crashing into the tower, I ran over to our local firehouse and told them I'm a Vietnam veteran, a former lifeguard, and that I'm in pretty good shape, and they said, suit this guy up. I held those heavy giant fire hoses for nearly 4 hours. Tony Fish, Nunziata, died last year. And if I wonder if he got that lymphoma at Ground Zero, well, maybe he got it in Vietnam. I miss him so. I remember coming out of the Spring Street subway, and there were 6 soldiers with AK-47s and machine guns. I said, how you guys doing? And where you from? I told the guy from Boston that one day the Red Sox would win the World Series. Do you remember the great fear that came upon us from the terrorists and from the White House that tried to stop all our visions of a better world and the paranoia that still hangs over us? Do you remember there was a big difference talking to folks before and after we invaded those countries? I remember I had to gather all my love and keep it working for me, and it's still so hard. Do you remember, and you wondered if it would ever get any better than this, and you still do? I remember changing my answering machine message to, hi, you've reached Steve, Pamela, and Baba. We're out making the world a better place to live in. At the beep, leave a message. So, there we go, there we go, there we go, there we go.